Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sharia Away Book Club. This is the container where we discuss the chapter that was read for the read aloud. So we have moved into a new section of the text, and the title of that section is The Mysticism of Sound. And the chapter that was read aloud was chapter one, The Silent Life. And so yeah, I wanted to just hold space today for this discussion. Um, this was a really intriguing chapter for me, um, mainly because I feel like the narrator, or Hazrat Inayat Khan himself, takes on like a different kind of tone in this chapter, which is really fascinating to me. Um, hey, Ali. I said Ali. Hey, Ahmed. It is the way. The entire container started late, Ahmed, so it's totally fine. Yeah, that's cool. But yeah, I think one thing that really stood out to me was the way that the tone, or I guess, yeah, the vibe of this kind of chapter. Um, so like, there's a huge narration switch, and I think that's so funny. I wonder too, and I wonder, yeah, if you guys noticed that as well as you were reading it, like before we get into the contents of this chapter, if you noticed that like there was a different narrative tone, or maybe it was just me, which is totally fine. I'm
Yeah, I
curious.
was just kind of tuning into the difference between the first section and the second section, and its title being The Mysticism of Sound. And, I guess, like, if I had to think about, like, the tone of the first section, it kind of felt, in some ways, it kind of felt, like, really prosaic and evangelical towards, like, this idea of, like, what music is, and then also defining music um, in a sort of cultural specificity, which for me bordered upon like chauvinism.
Totally.
And of course, there was like, what I would call like more of the base metaphysics there. But I feel like already in this chapter, it's like, of course, he's using symbolic systems which come from a particular place. Um, and we can kind of get into that later, I guess. But I feel like overall, it's more about like uncultured metaphysics or like pre-cultural metaphysics.
Hmm. Totally. Yeah, thanks for saying that, because there is something like really stripped down in this chapter for me. And I think that, yeah, there's something that was either in the intention of the first section. I don't know if he like saved some of the narrative juice for like later. But yeah, this section, I think, kind of speaks or has this tone where some of the adages and some of the wisdom can kind of be applied to like many different circumstances. And I also feel like this is the first time in the text where like the interplay of like earth, like he kind of alludes to it at the beginning of the text, but I feel like this interplay of like earth and its elements really make it into at least this chapter so far. So yeah, I'm really enjoying that. Are there any parts of this chapter that you guys kind of want to tackle first?
I was thinking of reading something out. Is that cool?
Hmm.
Cool. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's like one, two, three, four, five, six. The seventh paragraph goes, sound gives to the consciousness an evidence of its existence, although it is in fact the active part of consciousness itself which turns into sound. The knower, so to speak, becomes known to their self. In other words, the consciousness bears witness to its own voice. It is therefore that sound appeals to man. All things being derived from and formed of vibrations have sound hidden within them, as fire is hidden in flint, and each atom of the universe confesses by its tone, my sole origin is sound. If any solid or sonorous body is struck, it will answer back, I am sound.
Thank you for bringing us to that. I think that was my favorite paragraph. I think that was the one that stood out to me, as well, among one other. But I'm glad that we've landed on this one. Um, whew. I guess, yeah. The first thing that comes up for me is I'm curious what it is about this concept that sound is the sound is the like primordial. This is how I'm kind of taking it too. So I'm also like adding my perspective into this as I ask this question, and I hope that's okay. But this idea that like sound reflects back to existence, that it is existence in and of itself, which is which is interesting because I feel like the like kind of way that I've learned it is that, yeah, first like there was the word and the word was sound. However, like science, I guess that's what was coming up for me even as I read this part, as that I'm like, huh, I feel like some of my education regarding science was being like confronted as I read this. I'm like, okay, so that's another perspective added to the question, what is sound? So I'm curious for y'all, how does this paragraph sit with your own cosmological like order of operations, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I guess I kind of call it like vibration. Um, just because like I kind of grew up in, yeah, I grew up in like the late 20th century, right? And in my education, I don't know why I'm talking about this as if someone might listen to it in the 34th century or something. It's like if any alien finds this on the 12th edition of the Voyager Gold Record, then please know that when I was growing up, I studied physics and we spoke about sound as, yeah, like in particular, like vibration, I'll say like longitudinal vibration of a medium. Um, and I think that I tend to talk about vibration generally because I feel like, you know, at certain levels, like there are vibrations that happen without a medium and they can also be transverse and not just longitudinal, right? Like, or you could, yeah, like light, um, doesn't necessarily need a medium that I think we know as vibrating the same way that air does to produce sound, which is why you can't hear anything in space. Um, but people might also call like the interplanetary medium a medium, even though it's like a plasma and it's ether. But anyway, this is just why I talk about vibration instead of sound, because I think sound means a very particular thing within like the
Mhm.
space-time envelope of Earth. Um, but yeah, I guess like, yeah, if I think about vibration, then I feel like the way that I think about what you call the order of operations in reality is very similar to what Hazrat Inayat Khan shares from many different lineages, right? And then, yeah, I think like there's something, I guess, like in my own gnosis, I'll say that the transmission of vibration to what I'll call like thought forms or like symbolized concepts isn't as direct as it's said to be in, say, like Torah. Like, I don't know that it's like God said, let there be light. And like it was already like symbolized concept. I feel like it's more like we made meaning of vibration.
Mhm.
And that's what it sounded like to us through the faculties that we've built, which have been shaped by other vibrations, right? Like, I think I tend to look at the development of our ocular faculties and
Mhm.
compare the, I think it's called like the f- the fen- the ontogenetic development of ocular faculties between different animals, and also like how those animals see color. And it's like, yeah, humans, we tend to think of color. We see a rainbow as like seven separate colors, but I don't think that's true for birds or for cats or dogs. And, you could say that like their ocular faculties and the way that they see color has not only been cultivated by like the vibrations of reality that they've been subject to, but also, yeah, like it's more important for them to be able to differentiate certain vibrations from other vibrations, which is perhaps why like they can see better in the dark, but they can't differentiate between colors as well as humans, allegedly, right?
Mhm.
Um, so in that same way, I don't necessarily believe like the God outside of our body was like, I need to tell the humans that there's going to be light, and then he
Right.
said like, let there be light, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna figure out how to let them know that these sounds mean the things that they do. I think it's more that just like a series of vibrations arose through God's awareness in God's body, which humans and various other life forms, individual and collective consciousnesses, have made sense of from there.
Ashe. Yeah, thanks for explicating and also like taking us on kind of like a re-knowing of the like cosmology of how, yeah, how vibration, I'd say, like sort of permeated through like human consciousness and yeah, our time space fabric. um I also really, yeah, I felt kind of like piqued too by what you said towards the end about how God is wasn't like, I need to like let the humans know that it was something that we were like part of the process of. And it almost sounds like in the example that you laid out, that in this like retelling of like Genesis, I'd say, which feels appropriate. I mean, this is the Sharia way. um I feel like, and if I'm off, like please let me know. I feel like that idea of like sound and vibration being part of, yeah, the meaning making, I guess you can say, apparatus that is reality, and like how human consciousness or consciousness altogether um has developed through the development of those different faculties, not only just like our sense faculties, but like our perception faculties, is something that's like coming up for me right now. Um, and then in the text, in the paragraph that you pointed us to, where Hazrat Inayat Khan says, the knower, so to speak, becomes known to themselves, or in other words, consciousness bears witness to its own voice. It's interesting because I feel like the idea of bearing witness is closer to how I understood. I said Genesis, but that's not what I meant. I meant the Big Bang. I just realized that, but it's much more closer to how I understood um, in my religious upbringing, like how the universe came to be. Even though that's evolved, of course, as time has gone on. But yeah, like this idea of like the knower knowing itself is very, very juicy, probably for like a lot of non-dual like thinkers or people who strive to kind of like, yeah, take up space in like non-dual spaces. I think would really love that, but I would also love for us to bring in, I'm being called to say it, like a pan-dual perspective. And I wonder, yeah, what that phrase brings up for you all, the knower, so to speak, becoming known to themselves. And I'm going to read the chat too. Mm. Nobu wrote in the chat, I'm going to read this out loud. I guess what's coming through right now is like, quote, how we think of light is not necessarily how God thinks of light or vibration, unless we are talking about a God particular to collective human consciousness and even particular lineages of collective human consciousness. Yeah, thanks for saying that. I'm kind of just like clearing something in the back of the back of my neck. Mm. Yeah, and I think that that's kind of like for me the thing with non-dualism. I guess I can say like in this moment that it's it lacks like the context of like what yeah, like which god, which pantheon, which cosmology. Are we just talking about like a god of humans, or are we talking about like a god of spirit, a god of like elementals? You know, all the like natural questions. But yeah, I'm kind of curious what does come up for y'all. Yeah, just even in this moment. Uh, so Nobu writes in the chat regarding quote the knower knowing their self. I feel like everything we come to know of reality is necessarily of a reflection of our own perception and the faculties that allow this that perception to form. Mm, hmm and then Nobu continues with, but we can also know more about reality and our faculties evolve due to that influence. But we can also know more about about reality and our faculties, how our faculties evolve due to that influence. No worries. Yeah. Um, Absolutely. Sorry, I'm just kind of like letting that kind of simmer and marinate. That's kind of also what you say, what you're saying about. I really align with that around everything that we come to know of reality is necessarily a reflection of our own perception and the faculties that that allow that perception to form is really alive for me because I also um dang, there's like a couple of things coming through, but I guess one of the things that comes to heart is like the limitations of like our faculties and how yeah, like some of those limits can um kind of act as guardrails for like how, and this could be appropriate or inappropriate depending on what context we're talking about, but I just thinking about the lens of our perception or the lens of our awareness and like how vast it can get or go is probably, and I experience this a lot too in like my own personal practice where um either I'm like meditating or just in a state of like reflection, and like some of the examples which I've probably like narrated out loud in some of these book club containers where some of the things that come through for me to be able to like filter my experience, whether it's of the physical or metaphysical, has to do with like things that I've seen or things that I've experienced. And very, I won't say very rarely, but rarely do my like internal happenings tend to reflect like a larger scope that's like outside of my perceptual lens. So in other words, like sometimes I'll like have experiences where I'm like witness to things and sensations and downloads, but then the way that like my field is like translating that is like through like a television show that I watched, a song that I really love, and like through like the moments. And it's like it's not that it's like hard to capture it, but I guess yeah, it kind of speaks to the ephemerality of like vibration, and I'm glad that we kind of got that like foci early on in our conversation because I feel like the word vibration actually helps center experiences that are ephemeral, that kind of um, go outside of just the like capability of like what our ears can tap into. So it's really interesting. Yeah. Nobu writes in the chat, I'm kind of meditating on how phones and computers and the internet change how we interact and optimize for certain behaviors and punish others, and what this does to our gene pool and the epigenetics of that gene pool. Ooh, that actually kind of checks out. I won't even say ooh, like that's kind of like out there because we are talking about vibration. And I do think that a lot of people think about like they think about like phones and computers from like an EMF lens, but I also feel like the lens that you're approaching it is not that. So yeah, I would love to hold space if you'd like to say more. And I could be wrong. You could be talking about EMF waves. Hey Adam. Mostly non EMF. Okay. Yeah, especially with what you're saying, like how we interact and optimize for certain behaviors and punish others. Yeah.
I feel like when I think about that, it's like we're moving towards like an evolution of like, just being more sympathetic nervous system driven people, you know? I
Hmm.
think of this chart I've seen a long time ago, and it was like, it's one of those charts where you wonder how do you even come up with the data that's underlying this chart. It's basically about like the amount of spare time people had, and it's looking back like hundreds of years, which is why again it's questionable, right? But it just shows how like it's probably a little more accurate now, but it's just the amount of free time we have just really drastically decreases. But yeah, it makes me wonder how will that actually change how our nervous system actually functions, and how does that actually prevent, or how does that in turn play out with these ephemeral, experiences that we have, right? Or these non-typical experiences that currently is non-typical. Maybe it was a lot more typical before because of, again, just the stressors that, or we were just having less stress living life, right? So I'll just throw that in the mix.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. Yeah, and I think about that fairly often, and I think it kind of relates to the initial question. So I'm gonna hold space and see what comes up for others before I potentially get on my soapbox. Go ahead. um, I'm just reading the chat a little bit. But yeah, our behaviors and orchestrated behaviors, Nobu writes, and the karmic tubes that cause certain behaviors to arise and others to be hidden. Hmm. Oh, we got some audio issues going on. Yeah, I was really struck by that too. I wonder if the audio is coming through clearer, Adam. But yeah, that quote up here is like almost the crux of what Ahmed said. Quote, the evolution towards being more sympathetic, nervous system driven people. And I would have to agree. Because I'm also like thinking about corollary wise, or like looking at the correlations between like the uptick of like um within at least like my social stratosphere, like the uptick of like meditation practices, spiritual practices at the behest of like a global shielding pandemic a couple years ago was like not a coincidence to me. But also like even before that, like I remember um like kind of feeling into like the wellness world before it became a thing too. Speaking of like my social strata, um, like before that timeline unfolded, I feel like I was kind of getting like nudges on that too. Like I think as early as like 2012. Um, and so I would have to agree that I'm like I think that culturally people are like shifting their focus. Um, and the reasoning might be different for many different people, but I also am I'm curious. Yeah, Ahmed, I don't know if you want to say more, like why do you think that's so, and how does that for you have to do with like this this web of like parasocial relationships that the internet like makes available to us, Ahmed, or anybody? Mm. Adam says this feels related to increasing neurodiversity to me. Interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna hold a little space and then mute because there's a train passing, so it's gonna get really loud for a minute. Okay, the train just finished passing. Yeah, so Ahmed, just to clarify, I think I brought on parasocial kind of relationships as like my like an example from my personal lens that helps me understand like the shift that you were speaking to culturally. And then I think on the other hand, it also speaks to how like the conditioning found in parasocial relationships and like how, like we've shifted culturally. And I guess I can elucidate more and like how for me at least, like we've shifted culturally from kind of having most of our relationships um, and like interactions with other human beings sort of be dictated by like our work day, where we like or how we trans transport. I don't know why I said that, but like like how we get to and from work or to and from other places, like our immediate um, environments. If we traveled, like this idea of um, uh like most of our relationships kind of forming like on the ground, I guess you can say, and then how like things have shifted from our not only relationships but our like muse and the way that we receive information from the world happening for some people, and I won't say everyone, but I'll say for me it happened mostly off of the internet, like hopping on Twitter, going on Instagram and like seeing what the tea is, not only like with my friends but with the world at large. And so, yeah, I guess it was a one lens that was helping me understand what you were saying. Um, but yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious, um, even if it doesn't connect to like sound or like vibration, how like, yeah, if you want to just say more about your perspective, I'm definitely holding space for it. If there's more to say. Social media presence allows us to be, and Adam says, spaces very far away from our immediate environment. Yeah, definitely. For sure. And I guess I'm kind of, just kind of curious about the karmic implications of that, but we can always move forward. Nobu says, would you call it presence though? And Adam says, that's a good question. Yeah, and I guess for me, like one of the things that I wanted to say, like on my metaphysical, like metaphoric, like soapbox is like, I guess for me, the shift of moving into, sorry, I meant to keep using your example. You're probably like, that's not what the fuck I meant. But if it is, like, yeah, I'm really struck by that example of like shifting to a parasympathetic, nervous centric society. And yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to say is that, I don't know, I guess for me, it relates to also, uh, do I want to say this? Some sort of like, yeah, I just can't help but notice. Again, I was going to just reiterate the connection between like spiritual resurgence and how that relates to being parasympathetically focused. Because I also feel like even the tone in this chapter that Hazrat Imyat Khan is taking is I don't know, I think it's kind of speaking to a perspective that is either like steeped in or like well well oriented with like nervous system reality, like vibrational realities. Um, and I feel like, yeah, it's come up a couple times today too in conversation for me. So I'm gonna read some of the chat. Nobu says, I feel like presence is what keeps us anchored in our immediate environment while we are communing far away too. Whereas if we're just far away, then we probably get disembodied and possessed by whatever is looking through the windows of the passing train of our social media timelines. Ashe. The passing train is funny because there was a passing train. And Nobu says that him and Anna were talking about this. Yeah. Because like the vibe gets changed, I feel like, regardless of how you interact with the world. Um, like what you see on social media, and then if you have webs of connections with other people on social media, like those yeah, windows, to use your example, have a ripple on our timeline too, and our experience, in my opinion.
So that last thing you mentioned was actually what I was tapping on when I moved away. So just kind of going off topic, but like that's one thing I wonder about, like how because of the fact that we can't communicate so far away, and that you know usually popular ideas regress towards the mean. It's sort of helping establish more of a unified culture
Mm,
or thought in the noosphere amongst the greater population. In a sense,
mhm,
which I think is not a bad thing necessarily. It's all right. It can also help strengthen when you're so you basically have a stronger mean understand deviation, like that center point is now going to be a bit more pointy,
mhm,
but it's also helping then connect these looser strands of people, right, and ideas that might have not um, persisted before. They actually have that connection that can be made now because the distance has gotten so much smaller to actually help
mhm,
send these ideas through.
mhm,
So like when nobody's talking about how if you're just far away and you're just disembodied, you can just look through, and you can actually there's just more opportunities of just that having happened. But just combine that idea of this whole monoculture with the idea of how we're just being more and more sympathetic nervous system driven.
mhm,
That in combination is actually, in my opinion, not bode well for humanity.
mhm,
Because if we're going to have a shared culture and it's one of where we're just being driven by more stressors in our body, that just doesn't. Yeah, just I don't see that going down a good road.
mhm, mhm. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for saying that. Hmm. Yeah, and I guess yeah, I guess the part of like overstimulation is like what comes up for me. Yeah. The fact that it's probably a medium, speaking of parasocial media, a medium for a lot more stressors to make it into people's lives. And then um I think that's where you get the flow of people who talk about managing their relationship to social media and parasocial media because of those stressors, or that added like relational lens to reality. Whereas like for a long time we were like, and it's interesting because earlier today we were talking about like evolutionary reflexes and how like I feel like we're kind of like circling to that like relational, that point of like intersection between that conversation earlier and this conversation today. Not to just like meta narrate what's happening for me in my channel right now, but I do feel like it's yeah, I guess to kind of use the phrasing that we were using earlier in archetypal hour with Adam, that I feel like parasocial medium is like parasocial medium and parasocial relationships, I feel, are stretching the the places in our field, or like our evolutionary reflexes are kind of evolving to either like make room for a reality that has many more that are part of it, or it's shifting to a place where we're seeing our exhaust pipes, so to speak, like burst, um because of like how stretched thin our awareness is being challenged to become, I guess you can say, for me. um and I feel like also like it just kind of applies to like personally where I'm at, and also probably like today I was like late for this container, which I think like I was able to find grace for myself mainly because I was like, yo, I'm stretched thin. But that phrase is kind of like what I'm emphasizing, like that stretching thin of the channels that we use to interpret our reality. Feel like they're being stretched even more in current time because of things like social media, the myriad forms of entertainment that we have like literally at our fingertips at any given moment. And to say that is not a read, I just think that it like there's probably a lot of studies that are also like correlating different pathological um, different pathological ideas around what's happening to our attention, which is something I think about often. Where I'm not necessarily like, is it ADHD? But I guess for me personally, I question like an upswing of diagnoses and prognoses about people's mental and emotional state, considering all the different social factors that contribute to that diagnosis, and also the fact that, you know, maybe perhaps evolutionary spikes are being pathologized as mental illness is a very like contentious space. But I also know I think about it often because of like my work as like what some people would call like a shaman. Um, so it's like I very often see it in that way. I also felt that way a lot of the times too when I was working as a special education teacher, and also like opening up to my mystic path like at the same time, where I was like, yo, I'm like experiencing these downloads about like what mental health is and what spectrum disorders are. And then I'm also having to like turn around the next day after meditating, like tend to these students who have IEPs, which is like state sanctioned documents that are like super like couple inches thick. Um, and I was kind of like having to like balance these two realities like unfolding in front of me. Um, so yeah, I'm I'm gonna read some of the chat, but I'm curious what that brings up for y'all. You can feel free to unmute if you'd like.
Wow. I have so much on my mind right now. So I apologize to all. I'm gonna try to keep it together. Um, but what you were speaking of, like, and also what everyone's been speaking of, this whole conversation, I think it's this relationship of like the vasting, the expansion of the internet presence, and then this other piece of the spiritual kind of aliveness that we're seeing at the same time, to me feels related to like this sort of planetary consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, yeah, it makes sense that like, I remember this one video was really influential on me. So that's really a negative, right? I have this one TikTok video that is like forming an actual worldview that I'm expressing to people online. So that's a perfect example of some of the ills of the era, right? Um, but he was talking about he had autism, and he had said when he was a kid, like for him it was really this perpetual state of awe, right? Where there's so much excitement and energy coming in. And he also spoke about how for him the biggest difference was in neurotypical folks. I forget the percentage, but the it was like maybe, it was less than 85 or 90%, which is what he was saying people at his end of autism had maybe of these associations, this 80-90% association number. This idea of like all these connections being made simultaneously, and what that would do to your ability to communicate this insane amount of energy and information that you're processing
Mm-hmm.
with real expertise too. And like it's an enormous amount of work that's happening. I don't know. So it feels related to this idea of like this need for humans to be able to somehow withstand even more energy, like almost like a fight or flight level of energy coming into the body, because there's so much information flowing through some people right now.
Definitely, man. I'm like, share the TikTok, drop the TikTok, because I love those things that kind of like push the envelope on like how I just see regular, everyday things. I feel like, yeah, I think one thing that's alive for me as you were speaking is like the stretching of that evolutionary capacity is happening everywhere. Like it's and like I don't it's interesting because I'm like, yeah, I feel like a lot of woo people talk about the collective, but at this point I'm like, I don't even think you have to be woo to see certain things, and see how the uptick of certain, of just like certain perceptions correlating to like how much information we're constantly being influxed with. And again, I can say I agree with that I'm like, we're getting stimulated to the point that would cause like nervous system dysregulation to, I don't know, maybe need like a couple of days of recovery at some point in time in history, where it's like now we're like getting that level of stimulation and simulation um in our reality, like right before bed, and then having to go to sleep and then dream saturated in that like vibrational like wisdom. And so it's like, I'm kind of hard pressed to not notice, but also not condemn at the same time, to be like, well, that's what we get, being on that phone all day, which a lot of like older people say to me. And it's like, you did that because you was on that phone all day, huh? And it's like, yeah. And also like my consciousness is expanding, and also like I'm like learning all these things that I would never be able to learn in school. So it's kind of like touch and go for me. But it's also something that it's something I love. I love noticing, honestly, at this point.
The way y'all talk about it makes me think of how like we're just the baby that just got a brand new toy, and we're just
Yeah.
going crazy with that new toy.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're gonna grow out of it, but we're also just causing damage of just focusing solely on that one toy. You know what I mean? Like my baby nephew, he's allowed to have gum for the first time. This kid had like 3 pieces of gum before like 8 a.m. And
I
yeah, he's
feel
gonna
like
pay for that in a bit. Um, but if we can learn from the lesson, if you manage to survive the lesson, if you don't have to pump your stomach because of all the gum you had, will we then be in a place to actually then where will we actually be better suited for it? Because now we have built up that capability. Now we actually have built up this greater way of being a monoculture. Sure, now it's being used in a negative way of where like nobody's talking about just bad content that is just what we get a boner off of. But when we then learn that lesson, will it be a lot easier to then correct that path because of these networks we've built up? If we don't kill ourselves by then, there's some silver lining there.
Oh no. Can you repeat the question one more time, Ahmed? Because I was like honestly at the edge of my seat. I was like, what's he gonna say next? But can you repeat the last question?
Oh, if we don't manage to kill ourselves by then.
Gotcha. Thank you. We have some action happening in the chat about parental social media use. Oh my gosh. I literally see my mom, and this is no shade to her. I've told her I've seen her regress like a kid in a candy store and like literally tune me out for a TikTok. And I'm like, damn girl, it's at that level. Like my presence and the TikTok, got it. Good to know. But yeah, I don't blame her, because it's also like, she's a person who didn't have formal education. And that's like my mom's dream. Both of my parents' dream was to like always go to school, or like, they always talked about how blessed we are to fucking go to school. I'm like, whatever, bro. That's what y'all wanted. But yeah, I just kind of think about it in that context where I'm like, well, she never went to school, and what she's learning is probably more juicy than like what I have to say. So whatever. Meet your new younger sister, Hoda. My TikTok timeline, Nobu says. I'm just thinking also too, like my mom and I will like send each other videos, and then I'll like call her later on in the evening, and she'll be like, "Oh, I'm assuming you had a good day because like we were talking on TikTok." I'm like, "Dang, girl. You know what? Sure. Let's just go with it. Let's go with it." But yeah, no, thanks for speaking to that, Ahmed. The idea of like us being a kid in a candy store and things having to go wrong before they get good. And I also know that there's lots of, kind of just to anchor us back into this opening up and this realization that like vibrational realities are like real. I'm like, yeah, I think social media is teaching us that. Not social media, but internet usage. And then also parasocial media, which are all these outlets that we're talking about, have like kind of pried open our consciousness for better and maybe for worse in some cases. But I also know that there's a lot of like ideas. I can't name any of them off the top of my head, but I also know that there are some like research and funding going into like ethical use of like all of this technology, which I think personally I think is going to take us a while to get a handle on, because I think that there's still a large lift regarding like even what we're talking about in this chapter, where it's like there's a vibrational reality, like this idea that like all things are like a combination or a marriage of these like primordial elements, like Hazrat Inayat Khan is speaking to, is like for me, I read that and I'm like, that's old hat, because you know I'm a mystic and I think in that way, but I also am like, there's a lot of people who are interacting with this interplay of like, let's say, fire and earth and like water and air through the manipulation of like technology, like material that we have in this world, but they're not aware that there's like a spirit imbuing this like material reality, that like matter has a spirit. And it's also like gate kept by a lot of like quantum thinkers, I'll say, but I think for right reason, because it's one of those things that I think mechanistically is something that you like people are being offered in this time frame a chance to like unlearn so that they can like relearn. And I know in the room we talk about that evolution from the like atomic age to the quantum age, which I think is, I don't know, I feel like it really relates to like how things are being broken down in this chapter for me.
Yeah, I was wondering if we are going to get to Hazrat Inayat Khan's formulation of how those elements map to qualities, and like I guess how it kind of inflects the current conversation in this container. I'm really curious if even like our association with those elements will change, if our consciousness changes collectively due to like the changes in our environment, including parasocial media changes, or whether like I think it kind of gets me thinking about like split narratives that are pretty popular in like New Age spirituality circles. I'm curious if anyone has anything to say about that.
No, I'm not familiar with. This is my first time hearing split narratives, actually.
Oh, really? That's wild. Oh, Ahmed's also like, what split narratives? I mean, I would say like they're kind of popular in like starseed-esque circles where people talk about like the arrival of New Earth being preceded by a split in human consciousness. And they talk about 2030 and like various like harvest events.
Yeah, I'm familiar. Now it's coming to me. Yeah. Ahmed says, is this their version of the rapture? Yeah. Nabu says yes. Ooh, I'm kind of curious why this came into the container. If you want to say more, Nabu.
I guess like what I'm thinking about is just like it's pretty obvious to me that the content that gets produced and engaged with the most on parasocial media is like highly upregulated content, or I wouldn't call it upregulated, I'd call it like hyperstimulated content. And then I would say that content which comes from people with like well-regulated nervous systems tends to get buried or like sidelined into different social networks or parasocial networks. And I can imagine, I mean, those bubbles are already diverging, but when I think about like what a split would look like, it would sort of require there to be sort of parallel, pretty much independent societies, like societies with supply chains for getting their like material needs met. Or like, naively speaking, you could say, you can imagine like one society which is basically like probably like a less dystopian version of the Matrix, where people are like very married to their devices.
Yeah.
And then maybe societies which are still more or less like well bonded to like agrarian civilization.
Yeah. I just, there's so much I want to say. Yeah. I've also read those narratives, and like as you were speaking to it, some of the stuff was coming up for me as well. And like I think some of the platforms that I've watched and listened to that have like that split narrative perspective on like how timelines are going on Earth are yeah, like they usually speak to like yeah, some sort of prophecy where like this, and I say prophecy very very lightly and very consciously, this prophecy where I've seen a couple platforms speak to like the prophecy where we're going into like a technocratic um solar punk kind of future. And yeah, a lot of the times I can't say that like people are wrong or like F them because they're like, but I do sense a an edge of dysregulation in their narrative making. Like quite literally, I think that parts of their consciousness are actually splitting as they precipitate and project that things are breaking down on Earth. I think like that's kind of like what was happening in those people's field. Just to, like give it a read, um, and I feel like it's. I see. Yeah, some people are agreeing in the chat. Nobu, Lexi, thank y'all. Yeah, I think that there's something that gets lost, which is like this integrative edge, which for me is very alive in the way that like this process that Hazrat Inayat Khan is breaking down about the way that elemental components interact with one another. So, like, in other words, I feel like a lot of split narrative progenitors are very keen on that because I also feel like often I feel like a lot of them are tuning into timelines where that what they see is like a possibility. Like, I mean, I think anybody could scry the current timeline and be like, oh my God, like we're heading in a particular direction. But I think what's missing from that is like, how do we comport that direction and how do we steer into that direction, both individually and collectively, in a way that actually um, loops in all of the different experiences, whether it's from an ancestral lens, whether it's from a cosmic lens, like all of this, all of these, I would say like spiritual supportive edges. I think it might even just speak to like them, the people speaking to these narratives, again, just being disintegrated, being disconnected from their ancestors, being able to go in and ask their ancestors, like, hey, how did you guys handle consciousness shifts? And what did y'all do when things were changing, like when there was an event horizon in your timeline? And I don't know if some of these speakers have like a practice that integrates that like unified field within their own selves, and like nevertheless trying to even see a unified trajectory for Earth as a collective. Like, to me, I feel like that's egregious as fuck. Like, if you can't see, if you can't see like harmonious collective like timelines like for your own self, then I think it's going to be difficult to be able to connect to Earth consciousness and see a timeline where we don't just take all the technology, for example, that we have on hand and just abuse it to its most basic principles. But it also feels like in this chapter there is something that's like anchoring, the reader, or us, I should say, in a reality where maybe we don't have to be smashed into looking at things from an atomic place and like build a habit or like this muscle. Like we don't have to be forced into building a muscle to widen our lens to a more like quantum lens, but maybe if we like get back to a place where, and this is like my ideation, right? Like if we get back to a place where we have like this reverent connection with the bare atoms that make up reality as it is, like maybe then moving into a quantum relationship with them won't be as difficult, which is totally a projection on my part and is like totally like me being like hopeful. I understand, but that's kind of what came up for me as I was reading this part of the text. And I'm curious what comes up for y'all hearing that, or yeah, just kind of letting that marinate for a little bit.
I guess like I've just been kind of coming back to a little quote from the part that I read out where Hazrat Inayat Khan saying the fire is hidden in the flint.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess like the way I think about it kind of relates to something I jokingly talked about regarding a TikTok meme that my mom shared with me. But you know, in the sense that like I feel like there is like a seed which can expand and be, you know, like there's like genetics, right, which can expand and be expressed by the watering of a seed that feels like it emanates out from those atoms and like subatomic particles which make up our material reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of like meditating on what it would mean to like be able to tune into that and to have it be valuable, right? Because, you know, if we are talking about like harmonious timelines of like unified collective consciousness on some level, then we have to recognize that like in our current time society, we're very dependent upon other people, which means that we have to generate value, you know, we have to generate behaviors which are valuable to other people in order for us to benefit from the value of their behaviors to us. And I'm thinking about material needs such as like shelter, water, clean water, you know, food, you know, even like clean air. And I'm curious, like, yeah, like what is the value of tuning in to the universe on that level? And you know, how valuable is it to people who you know, I would say like tend to enjoy spending more of their time in those like hyperstimulated or like I would say like dominantly sympathetic nervous system states.
Mm. Yeah, that's a very rich and beautiful question. I think, yeah, like there's part of me that wants to say like the value would be immense. And then there's like a part of me that's also curious if there has to be a bridge, or if there's a bridge asking to be built from how in current time people are engaged with their reality and like with almost, I want to say, like the subatomic part of their reality, and the building that bridge to a place where the value of interconnectedness in that way, because I think that's, I feel like for me, like that's kind of what that alludes to. Like if I'm appreciating, like if I wake up every day and have a practice of like not just like saying thank you to like the fact that I have shelter, or saying thank you that I have like clean water, to a certain degree. I live in Louisiana, so that's touch and go. Um, if I start a practice of that, then the muscle, um, to extend that level of, I guess, awe and appreciation to, let's say, like the land that the house is on, like the birds that are in the sky. And I'm getting kind of meta because I think that the bridge to create value for an interconnected, like unified field of like consciousness in that way. And I'd be curious what y'all think, if like that bridge needs work, or if it's built. Yeah, like if is it built, and if it's built, does it need work? Is it like still being constructed, or is it something that's like already done and we just need to like collectively like get on with life? Because personally, I think there's still some work that needs to be done, but I'd be curious what y'all make of that.
I guess like what comes up for me is something that Adam said earlier about neurodivergence and the emergence of neurodivergence, and then also just what feels like a reality of like balance and health in people's bodies. Where like earlier when Ahmed was talking, I kind of like jokingly said outrage and chill, because I feel like when people do spend a lot of their time in like dominantly sympathetic nervous system states, they end up having to, I mean, I feel like people often crash and end up in like parasympathetic nervous system states. And then it's like, what do they do? Where do they go when they crash? I think like this is part of why you start to see some research and funding when it comes to like safety, when it comes to the internet and devices, is because I think a lot of people do crash, and sometimes they crash through to a point where they end up with debilitating mental illnesses. And I feel like people who can tune into, I would say like, like I'll say like stay anchored or grounded in like communion with the spirits of like denser material energies, are usually able to, I'd say in my experience, like better cater towards the needs of people who are experiencing those kinds of crashes. So I can see not only like doctrine or literature or, like the outcomes of research into safety regarding what we do with our awareness being part of that bridge, but I can also see, like skillful co-regulation as being part of that bridge. And then also perhaps like wisdom around basically what I'm imagining is like as people crash, like they have like soft landing spaces to go to, and then they can also teach themselves to like engage with some of the blessings of more interconnected social media without losing their center, right? And then gradually this can become part of like more part of how people practice interacting with parasocial media and social media, and then perhaps even at some point end up being like built into the platforms and the apps themselves.
Rushing. Yeah, and I guess that's why I think for me that that really lands, and that it captures also some of like my personal hopes with just the different things that I do on the internet. I also have been hearing a lot of people talk about like not making your internet or like your internet connections like the only connections you have. And I feel like for a lot of people that might, like, I don't know, I guess I'm feeling into like timelines where that might be true for some people too, or like internet connections and the connections that they make on and through social media, parasocial media being like their main source of like interactions with people that they like have chosen to connect with, or like there's like that choiceful like conscious edge to the relationships that they're building. And I just am imagining how useful some of those like co-regulating and like reality shifting skills can be if there is a timeline for some people and some groups of people where it might not be, I guess I don't see this timeline as like a technocratic thing. I kind of see it as like a way to like share and diversify like power amongst like smaller groups of individuals, which I don't know, the organizational power of the internet, even though censorship is a real thing, I think is still vast, and it still potentiates a lot of movement for people, whether it's like social movements or personal movements, like personal revolutions. So yeah, I'm really hopeful in that regard too. I'm gonna read a little bit of the chat. Ahmed says, I wonder if what you mentioned now connects, what Nobu mentioned, now connects to Hoda's earlier mention of how wellness proliferated around the pandemic. Definitely. Definitely. I do feel like it connects, but I'm wondering if it connects for Nobu. I don't want to speak for you. Adam says, bridge building feels like the move right now at every layer. Yeah, thanks for saying so. Ahmed says, that scares me if that's the case for many. I imagine it would be a very small minority of people doing that. Honestly, Ahmed says, I wouldn't have even believed that could even be the case until I saw till I saw Teapot. Yeah, that's interesting. Hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think it's gonna vary amongst different social groups. Yeah, because I think the wellness movement was actually like bigger in. Ugh, this is taking me down an internet wormhole, y'all, and I'm like, do I want to go there? But it just makes me think of how, yeah, I think that that's true for some cases. It also makes me think of how many different organizations and companies started censoring like wellness. Um, what's the word that I want to use? Um, Practices, yeah, just wellness practices in their like human resource offices. And I'm not saying that any of those systems were perfect by any means, but I think it speaks to a curve um, in awareness, and that curve being, yeah, represented by this shift into maybe, yeah, maybe a more vibrational reality.
Could you speak more to that? You said that you've seen workplaces block regulatory, like, things that are good for your regulation. Is that what you said? Because I might have misunderstood.
Wait, can you say that one more time?
Were you saying that like workplaces or cultures block, subcultures block like um spiritual or regulatory activities? Is that what you said? Because that's what I understood.
Oh, no, no, no. What I was saying was that, well, I'll be more specific. Like the thing that I was thinking about was how um during the pandemic, and also like a little bit before the pandemic, how there was a big move and a shift for a lot of like companies and organizations to start centering wellness either in their marketing, like saying that their company was like a wellness centered brand, or within like in-house, where the staff and those who were working for the company were basically like human resources were creating avenues and pathways for people who work for certain companies to prioritize their wellness, because they understood, maybe intuitively or on some level, that people were burnt out and that people were like exhausted, and so they started building things and not blocking them. So sorry if that didn't come out as clear as I thought it would. And I guess the thing that I was thinking about was Essence magazine, which is like a huge publication um, for not only like Black celebrities, but like Black voices, Black creators, whole bunch of like marginalized people who are creating like culture shifts, have been featured and are featured in Essence, and how Essence created is huge. Essence also funds a festival that's in New Orleans. Um, and this festival highlights a lot of creators, speakers, and primarily musicians. Um, and how I think it was like right before the pandemic or the year after the pandemic, where things started to open up again, where there was this huge like wellness kind of segment built in, or it could have been a little bit before that actually, now that I'm speaking to it, and how like that was just like huge because, well, number one, like, I mean, that has never happened with that publication, but how also they were kind of also giving like that public permission slip for a lot of like folks of color and folks who come from different marginalized community to say like, hey, like your self-care and like your wellness and your physical vessel's well-being, like not only matters, because I know that that's kind of kitschy, but like these are the tools that can support you as you begin to prioritize um, not only like your physical health, but like your nervous system health, your parasymp. They didn't say that, but that was definitely par for the course on their event docket and also like for the platform in general. Yeah, but then yeah. So Ahmed also says, my company just started offering free shitty therapy sessions now. Yeah, and I don't think that these programs are like perfect, but again, yeah, I think I kind of feel like it speaks to um if we're kind of thinking about like the way that collective trends and arcs like are responding to like collective consciousness shifts, then I felt like that was yeah pretty spot on for something happening beneath the surface. Yeah, I wonder if my audio is coming through a little choppy. Essence, yeah, Essence Music Festival. Thank you for linking, Nobu. It's really hilarious. Ahmed says about his company offering free shitty therapy sessions. It's like 20 sessions where each time you end up talking to a different person each time. Wow. Yeah, that's crazy to me. Wow. Mm-mm. I want to I think I want to hold space and ask, is there any part in the text that you guys want to speak to? I feel like, yeah, we kind of spoke to like the elemental descriptions and like framework that Hazrat and Yakan was like laying down. But I feel like we kind of spoke to it in our own way, which is very, very much more juicy for me personally. But yeah, curious if anything else is coming up for y'all. In chapter 20. Thanks for being honest, Ahmed. That's totally fine. I hope that like these containers can be structured where it's not like you have to read the text before reading. It's like preference. So that's cool. um I'll hold a little bit more space. Ashe. Me three. Um, well, if there is nothing else that comes up, I'm going to just say before I relieve Craig, thank you all for joining, especially those who joined live because it's unmatched. There's nothing like it. So I appreciate you guys. And those who of you all who are listening asynchronously, join the room, man, if you want to join these conversations live because it goes up and it goes down. Um, I might be changing the time and the date that these conversations take place on. So stay tuned for that. And for next week, the read aloud that you can look forward to is going to contain chapter 2 in the same section titled Vibrations. So come having read or lightly scried the chapter, having read or lightly scribed the chapter, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.